Hello, everyone. I'm here to welcome you to the wonderful world of children's literature, to give you some foundational concepts of how it's kind of evolved in past centuries, to introduce you to the different genres, the ways we categorize children's literature, and finally to the readings we're doing this week as we jump into picture books. So, just a little background on me. I'm an associate professor here at Delaware County. I've been here for 10 years. My doctorate is in Victorian literature, which is literature from the 19th century, focusing on British literature and especially colonialism. That doesn't so much tie into what we're doing. It gives me a great sense of, how things functioned in the 1800s in terms of children's literature, but it's been a lot of fun digging in to create a more holistic overview of the course for you. My interests are, of course, Victorian literature. I teach lots of composition courses, and I'm just always thinking about new ways to improve the way that that is taught. I love pop culture studies. I've recently published articles on the Big Bang Theory and Pixar's movie Coco, dime novels from the 18th century, and now I'm super into children's literature after doing all this research and preparing for our semester together. I live in Havertown with my husband, my two dogs, and 11-year-old twin boys. So lots of recent experiences with children's literature as well. What's the definition of children's literature, right? We've got to start somewhere. The term children's literature typically refers to literature created for children and adolescents, and that includes stories that have been orally shared, like nursery rhymes, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and folk tales. So, predating or before anyone was writing it down. The oral traditions, stories that were passed down that, of course, were eventually written down, but their origins were through being shared. You've got nursery rhymes. The ones that we're familiar with typically trace back to the 1500s when they started to be documented, but of course, go back much earlier. They teach children the art of conversation. So if you think, hey, diddle diddle, the cat and the fiddle, the cow jumped over the moon, it's kind of nonsense, but there's a rhythm to it. There's almost like a back and forth, and some people have speculated that the rhyming is almost like the babble of young children, of like toddlers and babies, and that they feel that they can talk back when the adult is sharing nursery rhymes. So that's certainly fascinating. I didn't know that before. Legends. Legends are unverifiable, right? Non-historical story that has been handed down by tradition and popularly accepted as being historical. So, for example, like the Sword and the Stone, I've got the image of like King Arthur. Um, don't know. I mean, even if he existed, I seriously doubt that he had a magician named Merlin that cast spells and pulled a sword from a stone. But it was a legend, and for a long time was simply accepted as being true. Folk tales, right? There's a big umbrella on what falls under folk tales. Um, they're almost like verbal short stories that typically have a moral. There could be magical events, of course, characters that we can relate to. And typically, right, there's some, like I mentioned, there's some kind of moral or lesson implied in this tale. And I've got a picture here of the tortoise and the hare, which of course is an Aesop fable, which qualifies as a folk tale, which just brings us down to a fairy tale. Now, fairy tales typically started as folk tales. So fairy tales, they typically feature like fantastical events or magical elements. And so again, all fairy tales typically originated as folk tales, but not all folk tales are fairy tales, right? Folk tales encompass all of it. Fairy tales we'll get into tend to have been written down, right? That's when they were dubbed fairy tales, when they were first folk tales were collected that fit this genre of having magical elements, and they were printed. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit. Myths, and I've got Zeus here. Above, you can see Hansel and Gretel as a fairy tale. But myths is a traditional story typically involving supernatural beings and forces and embodies and provides an explanation for something. For example, like Zeus, that was the explanation for thunder and lightning, right? And so now we don't typically believe that, as far as I know, but it was to explain a phenomenon that couldn't be explained. So we're going to just jump into the past centuries. It feels weird to say recent, but yes, mostly modern centuries, post dating, the Dark Ages and Middle Ages. I want to emphasize that for most of this history, I am talking about like Western society, like Western European and American society. We are going to talk later this semester about like there's been huge movements to make sure we're bringing in more global voices and more diverse representations in the way we talk about children's literature. But I'm just going to start here and then we'll build upon that. So in the 1400s, horn books were introduced. This is really the first kind of thing that was printed with children in mind. You can see an example of it here on the bottom of the screen. Horn books were like lesson paddles, and sometimes they were painted, sometimes they were carved. Often they were carved so you could rub paper over them. But it had the alphabet, it had numbers, it might have Bible verses. It was totally instructional. They weren't to entertain, but the goal was to spread literacy, right? Because you could hand this down through a family. Huge moment. I'm sure everyone's heard of the Gutenberg Press. That's how we got the namesake for the big online library, Gutenberg.org, which has free stories, resources, novels, all kinds of things. But Johannes Gutenberg was a German first goldsmith and inventor. And in 1454, he came up with a revolutionary way to have a movable type printing press. So all of a sudden, you could change the letters around and just print page after page after page. Um, Once he did that, he could produce over 3,000 pages a day. When before, of course, books were transcribed by handwriting, and even the most talented transcribers could only do 40 pages a day. So it just revolutionized everything. Um, by 1500, there were printing presses all over Europe, and there'd been more than 20 million volumes. So within 50 years, all of a sudden, books were everywhere. Like it transformed everything. I'm sure you can imagine that ideas are just going from one side of the world to the other. There's a sharp increase in literacy, right? Before Gutenberg, especially, there was kind of the assumption that most people wouldn't read, that you would need, especially church figures, to read the Bible, which was printed in Latin, and like translate the ideas for you. You would have no way to read it yourself. But all of a sudden, lots of books, including religious texts, were available. The Reformation movement happens largely because of this, and that was a move away from the Catholic Church, which is kind of central to most of Europe, and all of a sudden, you have Protestant countries like Germany and England. And I bring this up just as an example of all of a sudden all these ideas spreading um, changed the way and the opinions of nations. And we'll talk about how that builds to children's literature, but it's certainly relevant. Okay. Schooling. Let's move on. So in the 1700s, more students are being educated. Again, with the Gutenberg printing press, there's so many more opportunities for children to be exposed to books. But it's the first time you're really having books published for children that aren't religious in nature, or they aren't like the horn books that look like paddles that are just to learn, Bible scripture or math, or basic math, or the alphabet. So this is, of course, not the only example, but one of the first examples is John Newberry. And you might think of the Newbery Award, which is a children's book award, and it's named after this gentleman. Wrote a pretty little pocket book intended for instruction and amusement. And if you zoom in on the page on the left, it has rhymes like "the ball once struck off, away flies the boy to the next defined post, and then home with joy." So it's almost like a baseball game. It looks like some kind of similar game, but they're having fun, and it's rhyming, and they're learning, and it's not necessarily about politics or religion. It's just mastering literacy, which is a huge goal, of course, in children's literature now, but it hadn't been in the past. Moving on to the 1800s, and this is the stuff I knew before the semester began. Um, the 1800s is called the century of the child. My background is in Victorian literature, which is because Queen Victoria reigned over most of the 1800s, the 19th century. But if you look at the bottom left, this is the height of the Industrial Revolution, right? The late 1700s, and then throughout the 1800s. And a lot of people say that, Britain's industry was built on the backs of children. They were in workhouses, they were chimney sweeps like this poor young boy. They were working in mines, they were domestic help, they were working in, factories and textile mills and all these things. Um, but with the mass production of course, literature, ideas get out there. And a lot of people through literature and pamphlets were pushing for child labor laws. And there were poets like Elizabeth Barrett Browning and William Blake that were writing really, sentimental, emotionally driven poems about, one by Barrett Browning is called Cry of the Children. Like, children would rather be dead than living like this, and they're mourning, and they can't see they're mourning the deaths of each other because they would die in these awful conditions, like being in mines, or like to chimney sweep. They would keep children really thin and not feed them well so they could fit down the chimneys, and if they got stuck, sometimes they would light the fire beneath their feet. I'm sorry to be so morbid, but just to make the point that there was this huge backlash about the way that the Industrial Revolution was destroying children. And there was this whole push to reimagine childhood as children aren't just little adults who are learning. It's this magical time of wonder that we need to like foster. I know it seems we've thought it seems like we've always thought that way, but this whole like the magic of childhood is kind of recent. It's really like the 1800s in Western culture. And so all of a sudden you're having literature written that's just for the fun of it, right? It's not necessarily to teach literacy, to teach values. It's supposed to just be enjoyed. Um, of course, like Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, Alice in Wonderland, young adult novels like Little Women. Of course, there are messages and values in these texts, but it's really just to invite the children's imagination to and entertain them and the joy that they would get out of reading it. Oh, and I just wanted to hit that again, it was 1833 that through all these pamphlets and ideas that there were the first child labor laws, not saying that it made everything all better, but they did start to regulate. And this, again, this kind of idea that childhood should be magic and protected and wondrous and innocent, which again, it hadn't always been innocent, where we would, scrub out the scary endings of Grimm's fairy tales until this kind of movement. So it seems like children's literature was like the focal point of childhood, on top of toys and games. But things started to change in the 20th century, in the 1900s. So in the 1930s, in the market, you've got comic books, which I think you could argue that a comic strip or a comic book is literature, but we won't get into that. But on top of that, you have radio and films. So you didn't have a TV in your house yet, but there's some radio shows there. Like Let's Pretend was a popular radio show that came on, every week. Lone Ranger. So instead of reading, kids might just sit in front of the radio in the living room, like pet the dog and just listen to this. So it was really competing with the need to, improve your literacy and just engage with children's books. Comic books that were serialized and started coming out, which again I would qualify as children's literature, but it competed with traditional children's literature. Little Orphan Annie, if you've ever seen the musical Annie, it was based on this comic series, and Adventures of Tintin, which again something that's still out. Movies that were being made specifically with children in mind or families in mind were coming out. So Disney's Snow White was huge, and Wizard of Oz. And also, these kind of movies were transforming the way that these tales were told and imagined because they'd been kind of sanitized. And we'll talk about that more. And then moving towards the 1940s and 50s, suddenly people had TVs in their home, right? And that really challenged, I'm sure everyone who has kids with screens, you're trying to get them to read, and they're like, yeah, I'd watch YouTube. But even back in the 40s and 50s, there were TV shows like Howdy Doody, Captain Kangaroo. Um, Saturday morning cartoons were not late to follow. So just all this competition. So I'm gonna take a sip of my coffee. Thankfully, children's books are still very important to childhood, to children's literacy, and to our culture. And we're going to spend the first module talking about picture books. So, what is a picture book? Um, Picture books are designed for children when their interest level surpasses their vocabulary or their reading ability, right? Because the pictures are so central to the story. Words and pictures share the responsibility of communicating the intended message. The kids will kind of read the pictures to interpret what's going on, while the adult reads and deciphers the words. And again, the sense of story can be conveyed through the images alone. So they do need the adult to read the words, or for them, they reach the point where they can decipher the words. But the pictures either help them decipher those words, or they help them through the story as the adult um, reads it verbatim. There's a collective unity there, of course, between the picture books and the words. They have to speak to one another. It doesn't work. And the level of the children's book should reflect the children's intended understanding at that age. So if you're trying to read Corduroy to an 18-month-old, that could be a little bit, if you've ever read the book, it's more kindergarten level, right? So these books are specifically designed for the intended literacy level. And of course, some kids surprise you and can, comprehend more than we expect, but it has been designed with the children's developmental stage in mind. So, with that in mind, board books. So, if you've ever seen Sandra Boynton or Guess How Much I Love You, or The Very Hungry Caterpillar is probably one of the most famous. These are designed for infants and toddlers. Length typically 12 to 16 pages, lots of colors. They cover things like animals, body parts, ABCs, basic counting, very minimal words. And if there are There's often rhyming, right? Because again, like the nursery rhyming, it gets that babble and that interest kind of going on. Sometimes that they have flipped things that can be, opened, that they can touch or smell or even scratch, things like that. So this is very, very early learning. I remember my baby shower, a kindergarten teacher gave me Very Hungry Caterpillar, and she said, "This is the most important book they're going to have in early childhood. It teaches science, it teaches nature, it teaches math, it teaches, consequences and nutrition." And I always thought that was bizarre, but when you break it down, it really does. Eric Carle's book have all these like multitudes of ideas, even if it's directed at the most basic level of childhood. Early picture books. So we're looking at ages 2 to 5. They're starting to learn letters. They're starting to, there's lots of things they're now recognizing about the world around them. A step up in sophistication. Certainly, the storylines could be familiar to everyday life, or like first day of school, getting dressed. There's one Lola in the library, right? More advanced counting and language skills than you would see in a board book. Generally, about 500 words. There's art on every page, of course, and often the rhyming, kind of nursery rhyming, engaging, and because it's almost musical to them, right? The way that those books come together. Now we're going to standard picture books. So there's, you probably recognize um, Where the Wild Things Are, Curious George, Corduroy. You've got language skills, more advanced math than just counting, right? There's ideas of emotional development. There's universal values and cultural values being, encompassed in there. Just like Alexander's No Good, Very Bad Day, right? About how do we um, rebound after a setback? How do we manage our emotions? A lot more sophisticated, right, than those early board books. Plots are still simple. Typically, there's one main character that they're meant to identify with. It could be a social story, a fairy tale. There could be, fanciful animals. Humor is a great way, of course, and we'll talk about this with Dragons Love Tacos, of getting the child engaged. Typically around 1,000 words, and there's art either on every page or every other page. So, when you're writing about the books that we're looking at this week, you're going to be analyzing the illustrations because you need to think about how the art is meant to speak to the language and the language is meant to speak to the art. So, think about like the medium it looks like it was to create that art. So, of course, it could have been a computer, but especially early books like Hungry Caterpillar, Snowy Day, Bernstein Bears, someone drew it or used watercolor. Or with Eric Carle, it looks like they cut out shapes. So what kind of image does it appear to you? Like how does it look like someone generated that image? Is it rustic? Is it precise? Is it realistic? Is it cartoony? How does the image engage with the text? So there's a great page here. It was my favorite. One of my favorite series was Berenstain Bears, but it's clearly brother and sister are having some kind of conflict, and we can see that, and that they're out in a public space. So even though we can't see the words because they're so small, the illustration has brought us that far in the story. Color palette, like I love Very Snowy Day, kind of sticks to these like golds and reds and like neutrals, and that makes the snow stand out more. So what colors are being included? Is the art realistic, cartoonish, whimsical? What's the emotion behind the images? Because again, you look at an image, like when I look at Snowy Day, I feel like a sense of wonder, right? Like what's the emotion that's coming? Whereas when we look at Dragons Love Tacos, it's very busy and comical and energetic. So just think about these things when you're writing about the books that we're looking at this week. Values in children's books. And I think this is something, I'm going to take a sip of my coffee. As adults, we sometimes don't think about the books that we were presented as a child, like either to read or someone read to us, often, held really profound messages about life or about who we are, the community we belonged to. And that's something that we, have to keep in mind when we're now the adults and we're analyzing the book. And we should also think about it as adults who are giving books to either our students, our children, our nieces and nephews. It's so significant. Like I never thought if you're reading a book about, you know, um, monsters or witches, having a conflict with, let's say, bears or something. Usually they're those presented as the other. It's like a message from we treat people in our community or our society or in the world as they're the other. And the book is often typically trying to show us, hey, even though they appear different or from a different part of the forest, they still have the same kind, they're still, beings just like us, and we need to get along and be friends. Like, there's a very deep message there beyond this pretend book I've come up with about bears and witches not getting along. Um, so we generally agree the goal of children's lit should be to teach children to think independently, to gather evidence and use scrutiny. Didn't used to be that, right? It used to be more of like indoctrinating them and to like make sure they had the same kind of value system. And that's why some books are banned, because they don't like the idea that literature is doing this. Um, Children's books truly are a wonderful opportunity to bring children to learn empathy, to appreciate difference. So, like Fry Bread is a beautiful, story about Latin American, Mexican culture. Ping Meets Panda, again, just animals that we've anthropomorphized and how they can find friendship despite difference. Books that are popular with children often feature like the hero worship phenomenon, which is, just someone that could accomplish things more than a natural person could. But we typically think of heroes as being, self-sacrificing and putting the good of the community before them. And, children's books can accomplish all these wondrous things, but there are ethical questions to consider, right? For example, books have been used as propaganda to teach children that different groups are bad, or that they have a duty, that their interests and their well-being is secondary. Like, it can be very controversial when we think about the books that children are achieved. But let's get back to how are we going to evaluate picture books now that we have all these questions buzzing in our head. Um, when you're choosing a picture book to give to a child, again, you wouldn't give corduroy to a child that's 18-month old. You need to think about their level, their comprehension level of both the world around them and their language level. What are your goals, right? So again, especially in terms of educating and teaching, what are you hoping they're going to get from this? Is the ratio of images to words appropriate for their age? Is the style and illustrations, is it going to capture their interest? Like, if it's a very fine illustrations, like we'll see in Ferdinand the Bull, may not appeal to a toddler, but will be beautiful and intricate and, magical to an 8-year-old, 7-year-old. What's being taught? Again, the values. We'll talk about Ferdinand the Bull and why some people thought that book was controversial and didn't want anyone near their children. What are the values being taught? And what emotions are implicit to the text, right? Are we teaching justice, fairness, empathy, self-worth, family? We need to think about those things. Ferdinand the Bull. Let's talk about the 4 stories we're looking at. So Ferdinand the Bull was written in 1936. So we're talking, pre-World War II. And you've got the author, Monroe Leaf, and you've got the illustrator, Robert Lawson. And Monroe Leaf said he wrote the story. He was always already successful as a children's author, but he wanted to give his friend Robert Lawson, who was an illustrator and writer, some work. So that's how it came about. Um, and first run, 14,000 copies were sold for a dollar each. The following year, they were up to 68,000 copies. And by 1938, every week, 3,000 copies were going. So it became a very, very popular, if not the most, popular contemporary children's book of the time. In the Life magazine said it was the greatest piece of children's literature since Winnie the Pooh. Let's get to the controversial part. So when you read it, and you're probably familiar with the story, Ferdinand is a large bull that they want him to take part in bullfights, but he's a pacifist. He just wants to sit under the cedar tree and smell the roses and just chill and be relaxed. Hitler did not want German children reading this book because, again, the pacifist message, and you're allowed to not be what others expect you to be, and choosing peace, over conflict. Um, it's interesting that Hitler banned it because as soon as World War II, the Germans were defeated, I found out this fascinating fact that the Americans brought 30,000 copies of Ferdinand the Bull to share with German children. So they were trying to share this message of kind of pacifism and tolerance and understanding. Scholars have said one of the reasons this story is so popular is that even though it's a bull, like it's an animal, it's a very gender neutral story. It's not directed at boys and girls. Like all children can kind of identify with feeling that they don't fit and that there's a place for you. The art is absolutely magnificent. The bullfight takes place in Ronda, Spain, and even the bridge that Ferdinand crosses is perfect representation of what that would have been. And it's just a really fantastic book. I mean, in my opinion, that's why I signed it, right? It transcends time, much as Dr. Seuss, which I'm sure all of us at least bumped into in childhood at some point. He was an American author who published over 60 children's book. By the time he passed away in 91, he'd sold over 600 million copies of his books, and they've been translated into more than 20 languages. So, he was quite the deal, and he still is as children's author. Like, we keep finding new iterations of him, in movies. Like The Lorax wasn't that long ago, was it? Or am I dating myself? But, we're reading One Fish, Two Fish, but throughout his books, that, I can speak. You can tell my brain is starting to melt a little bit. He's created this fantastical, bizarre world of imaginary creatures that just appeals to children. I was just with my 3-year-old godson, and he told me he was gonna play, Get the Yak or something, which I believe is from this book. Yeah, Gak the Yak, and just to make language and make up games, and the children's feel like they're immediately immersed in it. So this book is so fun because the narrators are 2 children who are talking about all these creatures and, that are a part of their life. There's alliteration, there's rhyming, it is bright. It's all about imagination and encourages this kind of investigative attitude where you're trying to figure out what's going on from the bizarre image and by listening to the words and then adding your own, spin on it, trying to figure out, what's going on the page. 2 more books we're looking at. Where the Wild Things Are, which is, a dear favorite of mine. Maurice Sendak himself, is a Polish Jewish author, who came out at the end of his life that he was gay, and it just like broke my heart that he said he didn't come out because it would have upset his parents. And I'm glad that's where we're getting to books at the end of the semester, like Tango Makes Three, where we see representations of difference, and hopefully children's books can prevent this kind of injustice. But going back to Sendak, he's the illustrator and the writer. If you haven't read it, it's about Max who, puts on his wolf suit and is growling, and his mom sends him to bed without supper, and the bedroom transforms into there's sails on his bed, and he goes to an island where the monsters, wild things, make him their king. But then he smells his mother's food that she's, put out for him, and he wants to come home. There was initial controversy about this book because he defies his mother, or some people read it as, it's about home and food and mother's care that brings him back. Some people said, but I think Sendak himself said it's really about children trying to manage their emotions and get through frustrating situations, which I appreciate that reading more than the others. And again, going back to Sendak real quick, just some people banned this book when it came out. They said it was too dark, that he was rebelling against his mother, and they thought him going to a magical island was akin to witchcraft. So again, some people are just so sensitive, and I hate when beautiful children's books are kept out of kids' hands over such silliness. Last book we're looking at is Dragons Love Tacos. It came out in 2012, so much more recent than our other books. And I know they've had more recent publications. The author is Adam Rubin, and the illustrator is Daniel Salmieri. It was an immediate hit. It's silly. There's no like deep moral, but the dragons love tacos when they eat hot sauce, that they breathe fire. It's got like this fresh zaniness. It's kid focused because it's just about amusing them. It's not about teaching them anything profound. First print was 250,000 copies, which is a huge investment on the publisher's part, but it took off like wildfire, no pun intended. Um, the dragons aren't fully developed characters, which I think is important. They're kind of in the background. The kid is like the narrator, but they're fun and goofy, and the child's trying to make sense of it as they read. And that's what I think makes it such a wonderful, beloved children's book right now. I'm going to stop here. We have 2 more videos to get through. Again, week 1, information dump. We need to talk about the elements of short stories and poetry so we can use that to analyze these texts. And finally, I have a brief video on how to quote and cite when your responses and your papers.